Sirens bled from the wall screens as the conference room doors hissed shut. And Olivia Kane said, "No one leaves until I know who lit the fuse." The investor feed blinked red. And Daniel Mercer said, "It's a transient dip, hold your line." The call queue stacked like a threat, and Maya Brooks said, "We're hemorrhaging confidence, not cash yet." The rival's face cut across a news banner, and Ethan Ward said, "Markets punish weak shepherds." The board chat erupted with blame, and Olivia said, "Save the post-mortem for later." A rumor sprinted the corridors as if carried by the air, and Liam Perez said, "The short sellers are coordinating on signal." The glass city beyond their windows looked like it wanted to shatter, and Maya said, "Legal requests clarity now." Daniel steadied his voice, and he said, "Authorize disclosure, or we drown in speculation." Olivia felt the floor tilt, and she said, "Disclose what protects the mission and nothing else." The PR line pulsed like an artery, and Ethan on screen said, "Resign or be removed." Olivia stared into the camera halo and said, "I do not yield the helm in a storm." The lights flickered once, and the room understood the day had broken in half. The lobby swarmed with cameras like hornets drawn to glass, and Olivia said, "You will hear from me before the market closes." Flash pops stitched white scars across the marble, and Daniel said, "Stay narrow. Avoid liability." A chant outside rose against the thunder, and Maya said, "Investors want a human voice, not a memo." The elevator chimed like a countdown, and Liam said, "Forums are coordinating a run on our partners." Olivia kept walking because stopping would look like surrender, and she said, "Schedule the town hall and open lines." A question about ethics sliced forward, and Daniel said, "No comment until council reviews." The doors parted like a stage queue, and Maya said, "Truth without panic is our angle." A boom mic dipped too close, and Olivia said, "Back up or lose the story." The elevator sealed, carving silence from chaos, and Olivia whispered, "If they want blood, let's show them steel." The war moved to the screens where every opinion became law, and Olivia said, "Pin the rumors and answer the ones that hurt." Ethan's interview looped with surgical smiles, and he said, "Leadership is accountability." The anchor leaned toward spectacle, and Daniel said, "We counter with audited milestones." Messages stacked like hail on glass, and Maya said, "Say what we can prove, nothing else." A short clip showed a mislabeled chart, and Liam said, "That's fabricated. The metadata stinks." Olivia felt anger sharpen into a blade, and she said, "Cut a thread through the noise and pull." A trending tag accused the culture, and Maya said, "Bring employees into the light." The clock grinned in red numerals, and Daniel said, "Quarterly, call in 3 hours." Olivia met the camera's dead eye and said, "I'll make them remember who built this engine." The board chat hardened into knives behind polite signatures, and Daniel said, "I can stabilize sentiment if we offer a temporary step back." A caller masked as counsel pressed, and Maya said, "That request smells like a transfer of power." Another window bloomed with a private line, and Victoria Vale said, "Continuity requires sacrifice." Olivia tasted the word as if it were ash, and she said, "Continuity requires courage." A rumor about a compliance breach slid across the table, and Daniel said, "We disclose and survive, or bury and burn." The conference line chimed a ghostly entry, and Cole Turner said, "Vendor logs show an inside relay." Silence sharpened. Olivia said, "Find the relay and keep the circle small." The city thunder rolled again, and the room chose which future it wanted to believe. Night leaked into the windows like ink, and the building sighed as if exhausted, and Olivia said, "We stop bleeding when we start cutting." The city glowed with ambulance blues and taxi golds, and Maya said, "Choose targets that rebuild trust, not just punish." A list of names waited under a folded corner, and Daniel said, "Board confidence hinges on a gesture." Olivia felt the old fire lick her ribs, and she said, "Gesture is cheap, outcomes are currency." The spy rumor tapped like a metronome, and Cole said, "Access patterns point to a ghost in compliance." The printer exhaled the plan like smoke, and Maya said, "If we move before dawn." Olivia looked at the skyline and the mirror version of herself, and she said, "Then we move, and we do not miss." The building lights dimmed one notch, like a nod from the dark. The board gathered in a smaller chamber, the air dense with suspicion, and Olivia Kane said, "We shore up the walls before the storm cracks them." Daniel Mercer shuffled a thick folder and he said, "Options are limited, but pressure doubles every hour." Maya Brooks scrolled through a tablet and she said, "Employees see headlines faster than memos. Fear becomes policy." Liam Perez leaned on the table and he said, "A leak inside is accelerating the fire." I traced anomalies. Olivia paced with deliberate weight and she said, "Plug the holes or this ship sinks before dawn." A distant rumble of thunder folded into the walls, and Daniel said, "Investors won't tolerate silence any longer." Olivia's eyes narrowed and she said, "They'll tolerate nothing if we hand them doubt." The chamber lights flickered once, leaving faces pale as masks. The betrayer's voice arrived in clipped tones across encrypted lines, and Ethan Ward said, "Markets crave a stable hand, and she is slipping." Olivia clenched her fist under the table, and she said, "Let him posture. It means he feels the cracks." Maya shook her head as streams of data cascaded across her tablet, and she said, "His campaign isn't just noise, he's coordinating leaks." Daniel tapped his pen hard and he said, "Every whisper is worth millions on the open floor." Liam's tone cut sharp, and he said, "We can trace patterns, but shutting him down requires proof, not suspicions." Olivia stood taller, fire in her eyes, and she said, "Then proof we will find. And if he draws a blade, we draw sharper." The silence left behind was jagged as glass. The circle of trust narrowed with every hour, and Olivia said, "I need your loyalty not tomorrow, but now." Daniel shifted uneasily, and he said, "My loyalty is constant, but my position grows fragile." Maya raised her head, determination hardening, and she said, "I follow the mission even if it breaks me." Liam's voice cracked under pressure, and he said, "My hands are in the system, I see the rot crawling." Olivia's stare cut across them like a scalpel, and she said, "Then cut it out before it rots us whole." The chamber clock ticked like a hammer, and shadows lengthened over the table. Silence pooled heavy between them, as if each word could fracture the ground. Across a rival-controlled broadcast, Ethan Ward's smile carved confidence, and he said, "Leadership is accountability, and silence proves weakness." Olivia watched from the shadows and she said, "He thinks performance replaces resolve." Maya gestured to the feed and she said, "He's shaping narratives faster than we can counter." Daniel pressed his hand flat against the desk, and he said, "Public confidence turns faster than capital." Liam exhaled sharply, and he said, "If he wins this stage, the market crowns him." Olivia's voice carried low steel, and she said, "Then we tear his crown apart before it fits." The broadcast flickered as thunder rattled the glass, leaving a grim reflection of their faces across the wall. The crisis narrowed to a knife edge, and Olivia said, "Every decision from this point cuts or saves." Daniel loosened his tie as sweat clung to his brow, and he said, "Our reserves drain by the hour." Maya's hands shook but her voice stayed steady, and she said, "We move boldly, or we vanish quietly." Liam threw a set of files onto the table, and he said, "Patterns prove a mole deep inside compliance." Olivia locked her jaw, and she said, "Then we hunt it before dawn, and we make an example that no one forgets." The storm outside cracked white against the skyline, and silence after was heavy enough to crush the air. The private office door sealed behind them with a whisper, and Olivia Kane said, "If you're here to circle me, speak plainly." Victoria Vale leaned forward, pearl earrings catching the dim light, and she said, "The storm is burning capital, and my stake demands protection." Daniel Mercer tapped his pen against a folder, and he said, "Protection can mean extraction, or it can mean fate." Maya Brooks locked eyes with Victoria, and she said, "Faith has a cost that numbers alone can't carry." Olivia's hand tightened on the desk edge, and she said, "You invested in me, not in shadows." Victoria smiled without warmth, and she said, "I invest in survival, and survival favors the strongest." The air felt like glass ready to crack as silence gathered its teeth. In the buzzing operations center, Liam Perez's voice cracked, and he said, "This account log doesn't belong. Someone's moving under false clearance." Olivia loomed behind him and she said, "Trace it before the leak floods the floor." Maya Brooks leaned over a console and she said, "The signatures mimic old credentials, someone from inside compliance." Daniel Mercer's face tightened and he said, "If we expose it publicly, we invite collapse." Olivia's hand cut the air and she said, "Collapse comes faster if we let ghosts walk our halls." Liam's fingers flew across the keyboard and he said, "Trail points inward, and it's closer than we feared." The monitors bled red as tension etched the room's silence. The older figure entered the dim lounge with a cane tapping softly, and Richard Hale said, "You think storms are new, but storms just recycle faces." Olivia's tone sharpened, and she said, "You watched empires fall, now guide me through this blaze." Richard eased into a leather chair, shadows hugging him, and he said, "Ambition eats its own, and trust rots from the inside first." Maya's voice wavered but stayed steady, and she said, "We can't afford rot, not now." Richard lifted a glass with trembling fingers, and he said, "You can't kill rot, you only cut faster than it spreads." Olivia stood in the flickering firelight, and she said, "Then we cut with precision, not hesitation." His sigh carried decades of broken crowns. The investor call began with muted cameras flickering on, and Victoria Vale said, "Stability requires decisive leadership, not promises." Ethan Ward appeared on a split feed, smirk sharp, and he said, "The market is ready for transition." Olivia's voice cut firm, and she said, "Transition is a word for vultures circling prey." Maya Brooks whispered to Daniel and she said, "They're orchestrating a coup in plain sight." Daniel clenched his jaw, and he said, "If we lose this call, we lose the floor." Olivia leaned forward, eyes locked, and she said, "Then they will not take this crown without breaking their hands on it." Static buzzed as the call bled menace. The truth crashed through when Liam Perez slammed a file on the table, and he said, "These leaks come from within compliance, signed by someone high." Olivia's pulse raced and she said, "Name the source or burn the bridge." Maya Brooks sifted the pages, and she said, "This pattern repeats, always routed through one secure channel." Daniel Mercer's face drained, and he said, "That channel belongs to someone we trusted." Olivia's voice hardened into stone, and she said, "Trust ends tonight, we purge the cancer." The silence stretched, carved into terror, as the names stared from the paper like ghosts risen. The night cracked with alarms as system screens bled red, and Olivia Kane said, "We're under coordinated strike." Liam Perez's voice raced and he said, "Files are vanishing from compliance vaults in real time." Maya Brooks steadied herself against the table, and she said, "This is sabotage with fingerprints buried deep." Daniel Mercer gripped the console, and he said, "If this spreads, we lose more than secrets, we lose control." Olivia's jaw locked, and she said, "Then we choke their channel and seal the breach." Lightning flared outside, painting faces white with dread. The room rattled with urgency as every keystroke became survival. In the narrow corridor, Cole Turner lowered his voice, and he said, "The breach wasn't foreign, it was planted." Olivia's glare sliced through the dim, and she said, "Planted by whom?" Cole's eyes darted to a sealed file, and he said, "By someone with board-level clearance." Maya's breath hitched, and she said, "That narrows the circle to a knife point." Daniel's tone fell heavy, and he said, "If this leaks, trust dies instantly." Olivia pressed closer, shadows carving her jaw, and she said, "Then silence holds until we draw the knife ourselves." The hallway lights flickered, as if the building itself listened. The counterstrike room hummed like a battlefield, and Liam Perez said, "We can reroute their attack into a dead loop." Olivia leaned over his shoulder and she said, "Do it fast or we bleed everything." Maya Brooks adjusted headsets, and she said, "Legal is calling nonstop. They're demanding a formal report." Daniel Mercer slammed his palm on the table, and he said, A report without control is suicide. Olivia's eyes narrowed, her tone sharp, and she said, "Control comes before confession." Sparks of data burst across the monitors, war written in code. The storm beyond the glass echoed their chaos. The rivals' campaign erupted on every network. Ethan Ward's voice crisp, and he said, "Leadership absent leaves only decay." Olivia stared at the feed, and she said, "He poisons with elegance." Maya Brooks leaned close, and she said, "His narrative sticks, every word sharpened." Daniel Mercer muttered, and he said, "Markets react to performance, not intention." Olivia drew a breath like fire, and she said, "Then we perform war louder than his whispers." The broadcast shifted into headlines of collapse, and thunder rolled as if the city itself cast judgment. Silence pressed down, waiting for retaliation. The boardroom clash tore like thunder, voices colliding, and Victoria Vale said, "Confidence demands sacrifice." Olivia slammed her hand flat and she said, "Sacrifice will not be me." Daniel Mercer's voice rose, and he said, "The numbers don't forgive arrogance." Maya Brooks stood, fire in her tone, and she said, "Numbers don't breathe, people do." Liam Perez burst in, breathless, and he said, "The mole's channel confirms it's one of us." Silence shredded the air, heavy as lead. Olivia's voice cut through, calm as steel, and she said, "Then this table decides its loyalty tonight." The storm outside mirrored the war inside. The revelation tore the room apart as Liam Perez slammed the evidence onto the table, and he said, "The breach leads back to Daniel." Silence crushed the air, and Maya Brooks whispered, "It can't be, not after everything." Daniel Mercer's face strained of color, and he said, "You think I'd torch the company I built alongside her?" Olivia Kane's eyes locked onto his, and she said, "Loyalty wears masks, and betrayal wears smiles." Victoria Vale's voice slithered through the speaker, and she said, "The strongest cut weak ties before they're strangled." Daniel's fist trembled against the wood, and he said, "I was framed, and someone wants me gone." Olivia's voice was steady as iron, and she said, "If you're innocent, the storm will prove it, but if not, tonight is your reckoning." The Empire's foundations cracked as investors fled, screens bleeding red, and Olivia Kane said, "If we don't anchor, we drown in minutes." Maya Brooks scanned the feeds, and she said, "Billions gone in a breath. Faith collapsing faster than numbers." Liam Perez gritted his teeth, and he said, "Their narrative has infected every corridor." Daniel Mercer tried to steady his voice, and he said, "If you abandon me, you abandon your chance at survival." Olivia shot him a glare, and she said, "Survival isn't won through pity, it's won through fire." The storm rattled glass panes like drums of war. In the secluded chamber, a hidden file cracked open, and Maya Brooks said, "This signature matches the betrayer's hand, not Daniel's." Liam Perez leaned in, eyes wide, and he said, "Then someone set him up from the shadows." Olivia Kane's pulse sharpened, and she said, "Whoever wears that mask will feel the blade of truth." Daniel Mercer's voice quivered, and he said, "They needed me broken to crown another." Victoria Vale's message buzzed across the speaker, and she said, "Power shifts to those who seize it, not those who wait." Olivia's hand pressed the table edge, and she said, "Then we seize before the final hour." The storm's rumble answered her vow. The mentor's voice rasped across the lounge, and Richard Hale said, "Betrayal is never born in a day, it's cultivated over years." Olivia Kane stood before the fire, and she said, "Then we burn the garden before it chokes us." Maya Brooks leaned forward, and she said, "The evidence clears Daniel but indicts someone higher." Liam Perez's tone cut like glass, and he said, "Victoria fed Ethan the data. Her fingerprints stain every file." Richard sighed deeply, and he said, "A hidden hand always hides deeper motives." Olivia's eyes narrowed, and she said, "Then she learns power isn't free, and Ethan bleeds with her." The flames snapped like applause, sealing the vow. The realization landed like thunder, and Olivia Kane said, "Victoria was the architect all along." Daniel Mercer's face twisted in bitter relief, and he said, "She broke me to crown Ethan." Maya Brooks spread documents across the table, and she said, "Every thread leads to her capital web." Liam Perez's tone was sharp, and he said, her moves weren't just betrayal. They were design. Olivia's voice burned low, and she said, then design becomes destruction. Lightning flashed across the skyline, and the boardroom vibrated with resolve. Silence reigned as they prepared to strike back. The counterstrike plan spread across the table like a battle map, and Olivia Kane said, we move before dawn or lose the war. Maya Brooks' voice steadied, and she said, our data leaks are mapped. We hit the rival networks first. Liam Perez's hands trembled but moved quickly, and he said, I'll reroute firewalls into choke points. They'll feel the cage. Daniel Mercer leaned forward, jaw set, and he said, if we cut their lifeline, we risk cutting ours too. Olivia's glare silenced him, and she said, better a scar than a grave. The storm rumbled outside like a warning, screens glowing with lines of code waiting for command. The rival feed came alive with Ethan Ward's grin, and he said, your empire falls while you scramble in shadows. Olivia Kane stepped closer to the screen and she said, your crown breaks when truth burns through. Victoria Vale's voice cut icy through another window, and she said, truth is a commodity, and I own it. Maya Brooks whispered sharply, and she said, they're staging the takeover live, a broadcast coup. Daniel Mercer clenched his fists, and he said, if this goes unchecked, the board will turn in minutes. Olivia's voice hardened like stone, and she said, then we strike in full view, let the world see their rot. The confrontation erupted in the boardroom, voices colliding like thunder. Victoria Vale's tone was sharp, and she said, you've lost control, Olivia, step aside. Daniel Mercer slammed a document down and he said, proof shows you engineered the fall. Ethan Ward's face glared through the wall feed, and he said, strong leaders don't hide behind accusations. Maya Brooks raised her voice, and she said, strong leaders don't betray their own empire. Olivia's voice sliced the storm of words, and she said, tonight decides who commands, and I do not yield. Silence cracked open before chaos returned with greater force. The storm outside mirrored the breaking inside as Daniel Mercer shouted, she planned the sabotage. I won't stand silent. Victoria Vale smirked coldly from the screen and she said, sacrifice feeds the market, and you were the weakest link. Maya Brooks' eyes glowed with fire, and she said, weakness is letting corruption reign unchecked. Liam Perez entered breathless, and he said, their system cracked under our reroute. We have leverage. Olivia Kane's gaze burned across the table, and she said, then we strike now while their empire bleeds. The lightning crash shook the chamber like an omen of war. The confrontation peaked as Olivia Kane slammed her palm onto the table, and she said, this ends with truth or ruin. Ethan Ward sneered from the feed, and he said, your truth dies in flames. Victoria Vale's tone was icy, and she said, markets move faster than vengeance, and I already hold their favor. Maya Brooks shouted, and she said, your favor won't shield you when evidence floods the light. Daniel Mercer's voice cut raw, and he said, proof stands, and the board must choose. Olivia's voice carried steel, and she said, then let them choose now, in full sight of the storm. Silence fell like a blade as the storm outside screamed. The vote cut through the storm like a blade, and Olivia Kane said, record the result and publish. Victoria Vale's feet froze at the verdict, and she said, you mistake revenge for order. Ethan Ward bared a thin smile, and he said, markets forget faster than knives. Daniel Mercer steadied the room, and he said, they remember what stands when the smoke clears. Maya Brooks lifted the dossier and she said, evidence holds, and so do we. Liam Perez exhaled as the screens went dark, and he said, their channels just died. Olivia faced the glass city and said, we rebuild in daylight or not at all. Silence followed like a warning, heavy and bright. The crisis team gathered among half-empty cups and tired air. And Olivia Kane said, we pay the fines. We keep the core. Daniel Mercer rubbed his temples and he said, cash survives, pride limps. Maya Brooks traced a new plan, and she said, "We speak to people first, then markets." Liam Perez pushed a clean report, and he said, "The breach is sealed. Audit confirms." Olivia studied the loss column and said, "We lost less than our soul, that is the work now." Daniel nodded once, and he said, "A quieter empire can still roar." The building hummed with mourning systems, patient and stern. The town hall lights warmed faces that had weathered a siege, and Olivia Kane said, "You are the reason we still stand." A tremor of relief crossed the crowd, and Maya Brooks said, "Truth travels farther when we carry it together." Liam Perez stepped to the mic, and he said, "We learned, and we locked the doors that hurt us." Daniel Mercer stayed near the edge, and he said, "We will change how power moves here." Olivia looked across the rows and said, "Choose courage daily, even when it stings." Applause rose like rain, easing, human and real. In the lounge where old fires spoke in embers, Richard Hale said, "Victory taxes the heart more than defeat." Olivia Kane stood without armor, and she said, "I traded pieces to keep the board." Daniel Mercer watched the flames, and he said, "Some pieces you never get back." Maya Brooks folded a letter, and she said, "Settlements land today, scars later." Olivia touched the glass and said, "Let the scars remind us where not to bleed." Richard's sigh settled like dust, and he said, "Hold power, but let it hold you less." The room kept its secrets, warm and unforgiving. Alone in the corner office, dawn thinned the night into silver, and Olivia Kane said, "The cost stands paid for now." A phone buzzed with a message that carried no name, and she said, "Then storms still circle." She lifted the nameplate and set it down, and she said, "Power is borrowed, never owned." Far below, the city began its day, and she said, "Let them come hungry. We will not be meat." The room breathed once as lights settled to steady. She walked toward the door and did not look back. The silence that followed felt like a promise and a threat.